because the Wi-Fi sucks. And as I was bailing out, what's up, Reggie? We find out that Nick Caley's been hired as the offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans, which is good because I think I was in the middle of saying that it seems like Nick Caley is probably the front runner. Couple things about him. I see a lot of people immediately see that, oh, he's from the Rams. Okay, well, it's just another Shanahan, McVay, or Shanahan, McVay, Kubiak hire. For one, I think that's a little bit of a hasty generalization because all these coordinators end up doing their own thing. But Kayley spent 7 years in New England working under much different circumstances. Josh McDaniels operates a lot differently than a way a lot of the Shanahan acolytes do. So I think this is a guy that's seen different ways to do it. And then the way Sean McVay transitioned from being a Shanahan guy really immediately his first year with LA when they realized they had more good wide receivers than tight ends. McVay changed based on his personnel, and then eventually would change again and went away from being an outside zone run-based team. So all that to say, there's no way to know exactly what type of an offense Nick Caley is going to run. It's also worth pointing out that he has been sought after. He was offered $3 million a year last year to coach the Patriots, to be the Patriots offensive coordinator. He turned that down. He took himself out of the conversation with the Jets when the Jets reportedly had him as their number one target for their offensive coordinator. Not that means that, hey, just because a guy is wanted by other teams, that it means he's definitely a good offensive coordinator. But I think he has been tagged as a guy that's got a head on his shoulder and a brain in his skull. And as I said, he's done it multiple different ways. Casario's got personal time with him by way of they would have spent 5 years together or so in New England. I'm at Radio Row, by the way, so if that's what any of the commotion you're hearing behind you, that's the radio/streaming row. Let's see. Looking on the line, there's no info as to what team he played for. He went to John Carroll, so he was not an NFL player, if that's what you're thinking. Let's see, UXG Freestyles, who was a noted doubter of Bobby Slowick for a long time, says hopefully a good O-line is part of his scheme. Okay, this is what's good. This is what I like about Nick Caley. When he was in New England, the entire time he was in New England, he was a tight ends coach. So he's been involved in the run game, not just as an afterthought or something that those fat guys are doing. He's been a part of coaching some pretty effective tight ends in New England, and B, like how much those guys are involved, not just in run blocking, but in pass protection. So ideally, hopefully what you're going to get is a guy that sees the whole picture and understands not just how to be an architect of a passing offense, but an offense in its whole. So I'm happy about that. There's not a whole lot out there on him, partly because Belichick does such a good job of keeping guys under lock and key and limiting their availability. Also beating them down mentally and emotionally and maybe making them feel like they're not all that special. I like that. I like somebody that's been beat down a little bit. Andrew Mandrew says, let's go. I'm happy with this hire. Frank Z, he's got a ton of experience. Kayley coached under Josh McDaniels for 6 years. Brady and Stroud have similar skill sets. This is Ethan Matt saying this. Would love to see that offense here in Houston. This is one of the big differences between Josh McDaniels and the way he operated with Tom Brady, I think, compared to the Texans is the ability of wide receivers to adjust to coverages, option routes, whatever else it might be. And that goes a long way for a smart quarterback, which CJ is. CJ, I've lost zero faith in CJ's mental ability or his precociousness in terms of reading defenses and all of that. But ideally what you get when you have a system like Josh McDaniels and Tom Brady's, it's easier said than done because you got to be Tom Brady smart to be able to execute a lot of it, is that you can make your adjustments to what you read pre-snap. I think that with Kayley, I would expect there'd probably be a lot more emphasis on CJ's operation before the snap, on diagnosing what's coming, as opposed to Slowick where, yes, CJ could audibilize, but a lot of it was more, the kind of philosophy that a lot of those guys have is whatever the pass play is, there's answers in this play already for what you see on the field. And it works in theory, but when it comes to hot routes, when it comes to a quarterback really being expected to diagnose pre-snap, they don't tend to put as much pressure on the quarterback. So his ability to work with CJ and then alongside, I'm guessing they retained Gerard Johnson and Bill Lazor to work with him too. I think they could end up, if it works out with Kayley, they could end up getting like the most cerebral version of CJ Stroud, and CJ very much has that in him. He's a football nerd. I think he's going to absorb everything that Nick Caley is teaching him and wants to do with him. So I'm on board for it. Alcatraz says I definitely feel like McVay's style of West Coast benefits CJ much more than Kyle's, which is what Bobby was. Yeah, and these guys all develop their own style along the way, and I like that both. I think Sean McVay, when you look at a lot of those guys, has the reputation more so of being a boy genius or of just being able to adapt to circumstances and quarterbacks. I mean, one of the reasons I think that he wanted to go with Matt Stafford over Jared Goff was Matt Stafford's ability to see the field as a true veteran quarterback and to be able to do some of the higher level stuff. And then obviously the experience in New England matters as well. Let's see. Cooper Kupp in the future, asks Mo Heavy. It's a thought. It's a thought. I don't know. I'm not going to be overly fixated on that. If you had to have me choose between Cooper Kupp or the kid from Ohio State whose name I will not butcher on this live stream, I would rather go with youth, I think, and go on from there. But we'll see. Scott Ashley Sexton says, I'm very interested in this hire. Hookham says, I've got a feeling we might draft some tight ends like Gronk and Hernandez, LOL. More Gronk on that side, athletically, maybe like a Hernandez. And if you want to go to the kid from Penn State or whomever else, he's not going to be there when the Texans draft. I mean, do you get the most out of Dalton Schultz? That would be look. We know what Dalton Schultz's limitations are, but he has value as a receiver. And can you get the most out of Cade Stover? Yeah, a guy that, for those of you just joining the live stream, Nick Caley was a tight ends coach for 7 years in New England. That's the part of it that one of you had brought up also a couple days ago was it kind of rubbed him the wrong way that Bobby Slowick had never been a position coach before. And I think that's a valid concern and probably one that I should have thought about more is that, okay, he worked with Brock Purdy when he was in Bobby Slowick worked with Brock Purdy when he was in San Francisco, but he didn't necessarily have like the elbow grease experience of actually coaching a position, and Nick Caley definitely has that. John Wynn says, hey, Seth, big fan. Thank you. I appreciate it. I am now a big fan of you. Damian Pierce revitalized. Ooh, okay. So we've gone through two cycles here in Houston over the past decade plus. One was when, hey man, can we stop trying to be New England South? And then we were rapidly transitioning into like, hey, can we quit trying to be San Francisco East? I don't mind taking the best of both those worlds, but if you want to get the absolute most out of a running back, man, New England did that to a T, and we're excellent at that with Tom Brady as their quarterback. But I do think you probably see, hopefully, if Nick Caley's experience in New England helps him, you probably see guys like Joe Mixon being used more as a receiver. Maybe you get the absolute most out of Damian Pierce as a running back if Caley ends up being a good offensive coordinator. Seth, you're a truth teller. What's your honest opinion? Okay, my opinion is that first I had originally, as many of you know, wanted a guy that could be the head coach of the offense, who's had head coaching experience, who's been a coordinator for a long time in the NFL. Chip Kelly fit a lot of those, would have checked off a lot of those boxes, but it looked like the Texans were not really either pursuing Chip Kelly or anybody like him. Mike McCarthy was never linked to the Texans. We don't know if the Texans talked to Chip Kelly or not before he went to Oakland, but obviously they weren't going to go in that direction. So there's a lot of unknown here. and you're throwing yourself into a pit of unknowns whenever you hire any coach, either as a head coach or as a coordinator, or whether they have experience as a coordinator or not. There's a lot that I can look to on Caley's resume and get excited about, but yeah, it's with the asterisks that like we don't know for sure. And the positives are everything that I just mentioned, and we'll see. We'll see after this. I think first and foremost, probably the relationship with CJ Stroud is going to be the thing that matters the most. And when we look at whatever reports there were about CJ Stroud before the draft, but then I think from CJ and Bobby themselves, they would kind of allude to times they had butted heads while they were working together. That, was it just simple butting heads like normal guys tend to do on a football team? Was it more than that? We don't know. I like that with Nick Caserio's experience with Nick Kayley, got too many Nicks in the building already, that maybe Caserio has a pretty good feel for that. And, we can probably start maybe trying to reach out to guys who have been coached by Nick Kayley and relate their experiences to it. Talk to Gronk about it maybe. I'll just get Gronk on the horn. Let's see. Ant-Man says, what other coaches will Nick bring in and replace on the current staff? That's an excellent question, Ant-Man. Who does Nick Kayley? Did Nick Kayley have a wish list? And now, the other thing I wonder about it with Kayley is he interviewed last week, and in the interim, he walked away from the Jets discussion. I wonder how much of the last week, even as the Texans continued interviews, was figuring out not just the contract, but hey, who are my coaches going to be? Who are we going to retain? All of that. So they might have theoretically been having conversations with Nick Kayley about these hypotheticals until they got the name on the dotted line. So we'll probably find out pretty soon. So guys like Gerard Johnson and Bill Lazor specifically, Ben McDaniels is the wide receivers coach. Is Nick Kayley going to want to replace those guys? Does he want to work with those guys? He'll be able to have conversations with Caserio. I think a word Caserio would use would be frank. A lot of frank conversations about the pluses and minuses of those guys, and then we'll find out. Okay, Mary Buckley says, Clint seems to think we hired another Bobby Slowick with hiring Kayley as far as play calling experience, but was there any other more experienced play callers available than Chip Kelly? Yeah, a few of the guys. I mean, Jeff Nixon has a lot of play calling experience. Bill Lazor's been an offensive coordinator 3 times. They did have that option. They had guys in the hopper who have play calling experience both in the NFL and in college. I'm missing at least one guy I can't think of right now that's got play calling experience. So I think this goes into a lot of those things that we'll never know or be privy to is the actual interviews themselves, Caserio's previous experience with Nick Kayley, and everything else that goes into it. Mo Heavy asks about the offensive line. This is one thing I've said. I talked about it earlier in this live stream, but also, so for one, Nick Kayley has coached tight ends. So he coached tight ends for 7 years in New England. So he's well versed in having to coach run blocking and pass blocking. I'm optimistic about that. But as far as the Texans offensive line goes, I don't think there's a guy on that offensive line who isn't capable of looking way better than he did this year if he's on a well-coached offense. And I would put that at both the position coach level and the offensive coordinator themselves. I mean, we've seen those guys, many of them play better either under different coaches or even just previously last year, even with Slowick before the league caught up to Slowick. So I don't think it needs to be a complete and total overhaul on the offensive line. The more I watched and really thought about the offensive line after the season, I think you did see a different version of Laramie Tunsil, one that was more engaged in the run game in the second half of the season. I think when he reached the low point of having all those penalties, I think he committed to changing the way he operated. I'm intrigued by maybe what Nick Kayley thinks of Titus Howard at left guard. If you are not in an outside zone heavy system, I think either Juice Scruggs or Patterson has a lot more potential. If you're running power and duo and inside zone, I think there's something to both of those guys. And right guard is probably the one spot. And then I think right guard's the one spot that I think that you're probably just going to have to either draft somebody or go out and find in free agency. Jacob asks, how much do you think CJ had in this hire? I don't know. I mean, it's not like I'd be surprised if CJ sat down and interviewed Nick Caley or anything. I think a lot of it was probably philosophical and them listening to what CJ wants and what he feels that they needed last year that they weren't getting. But, maybe we'll find out about that a little bit more. Pop asks, did we interview Stenovich, the offensive coordinator and former offensive line coach for the Packers, at all? He was announced as a guy that would be interviewed by Aaron Wilson this weekend, or at least Aaron Wilson reported it. So I don't know if they ever got around to talking to him or not. He was intriguing to me just for the run game and the offensive line coaching element of it. Let's see. Ethan Matt says it feels like we'll be more power and gap under Kayley. Yeah, and I think if you go back to his time in New England, he spent the vast majority of his time in New England, and that was an offense that could do it any which way. They were just when Brady was running the show, and they were really good. I think this is the key. They were really good at coaching it up. And one thing that a trap that coaches fall into when they try to go to a Kubiak-Shanahan system sometimes I think is not really grasping and understanding how much coaching goes into running that system and how hard it is to get guys so perfectly choreographed that they can be good at it. If you take more of a game plan approach that Belichick and McDaniels like to use, and O'Brien when he was in New England, that it's a little bit easier to coach. It's a little bit more straightforward, but you still got to coach it upright, and you still got to know how to execute. So that'll be the big test. Let's see. Jackson Arrowwood says, other than the money, do you think there were any other incentives that made Chip go to Las Vegas? Well, we don't know if the Texans were in on Chip Kelly, for one. So we don't know for sure whether that was a either-or decision. If it was anything other than money, I think that the fact that Pete Carroll's 73 years old, the oldest head coach in NFL history, might have had a little something to do with it. I would imagine that maybe he had a conversation with Pete Carroll about a succession plan. Succession, right? Whatever. A succession plan. And Pete Carroll, maybe he just wants to have one last go of it, and if it's going really well and he steps down, then Chip Kelly can just step right in. I don't want to undersell $6 million a year. It doesn't matter how much money you have. $4 million more than you're making at Ohio State that's a whole boatload of money. So I don't know. We'll probably find out more of that as well. Remember, we're getting back Brevin Jordan next year too. He was supposed to be a big part of our offense this year. Yeah. Also, and real quick, J Dash says, don't understand why Texans fans were so gung-ho on Chip. Okay, at first I thought you said why the Texans were so gung-ho on Chip. We have zero clue whether they were interested in him or not. For me, the appeal of Chip Kelly was simply that you have a young defensive-minded head coach and who still spends a lot of time and energy on the defense. I like the example that a lot of other teams have successfully followed in the past, including the Houston Texans, of having a young head coach have a coordinator on the other side of the ball than the head coach's expertise, who can basically be the head coach of that side of the ball. That was one of the big parts of the appeal for Chip Kelly for me, was his ability to just run the show the same way Wade Phillips ran the defense when the Texans first took that big turn. Do Rams tight ends block good? Yes, and what's his name there? The scrappy little dude there. I think they've gotten the most out of him. But let's see. But he wasn't the tight ends coach with the Rams. He was the pass game coordinator. Well, let's see. Was he 2 years ago? Was he the tight ends coach? Then he got elevated to passing game coordinator. I think that's the way it went. Let's see. And to get back to Brevin Jordan, yes. And I think with Brevin Jordan, if you have Dalton Schultz, who's not nearly as good a blocker as he is a good option as a receiver, if you have Brevin Jordan, who's very, very athletic and can threaten just with his speed alone, and then you have Cade Stover, who can be more of an inline tight end. That's a pretty good group of tight ends as long as Cade Stover develops. As long as we're not in a position to have to watch Dalton Schultz block all that often, then I'm good with that. Seth, tell me if we are happy about this hire so I can go get back to ignoring football until the offseason. I'm happy about it. There's a lot that's unknown and there's a lot that's unproven, so we'll see ultimately if it works out. But like anytime you're hiring a first-time offensive coordinator, they're either going to succeed or they're going to fail. Sean Payton back in the day lost his play calling duties when he was with the Cowboys, so it's a crapshoot as to how it'll work out this time. There's a lot to get excited for, and that I will totally talk myself into over the course of the offseason. Let's see. On the other hand, Twilight Trip says trash hire feels like they're going backwards. All right, Twilight, listen. I'm fully admitting that in me being optimistic about this, there's a little bit of just me fantasizing about how it could possibly work out. But you also have to concede, if we're being rational human beings here, that you don't know that this is a trash hire, and you won't until we see whether it's a trash hire or not. So let's stop it with that nonsense. I don't know where I saw this, but I remember saying D'Amico didn't like the way Chip Kelly ran the show in Philly. He had something called No Sweat Thursday and Fast Friday, which D'Amico was not a fan. No. Okay. Yes, he did say that about how he didn't like a couple of the things that Chip did, but he's also credited Chip Kelly for teaching him a lot about the way to use sports science and a lot of the other things about football itself. So I don't think that's a fair characterization of how D'Amico is characterized this time with Chip Kelly. I think that there was one thing about because they practiced on Saturday, I think, right? Or they had whatever it was. It was the practice schedule more that he just didn't like, but that's not like that was an overall summation of how he felt about Chip Kelly as a coach. Thanks, Seth. Okay. Carlos Lopez says, okay, that's who they hired, so let's run with it. Never know. Could be a great hire. Yeah. And Texans for Life says, is Nick Caley in New Orleans? I hope not. I hope that he's currently in a dark room watching film, and he needs to be for 18 hours a day, and I will accept nothing else. Nothing less. Let's see. It's funny, Texans fans hating West Coast concepts and wanting to go back to Patriot-style offense. Give this man a chance. I don't want to overly generalize. I think it's really hard sometimes to pigeonhole a lot of offensive coordinators in the NFL to a specific scheme. Like what's Kellen Moore running in Philadelphia right now? It's got some West Coast concepts. It's got some RPO elements. It's a lot. And more than anything, I think what you want to hear from an offensive coordinator is that he's willing to adapt his scheme to suit the style of his players. And I think that's one thing that New England for years did things in such a way that you couldn't really pigeonhole their offense. I mean, it was a Tom Brady offense at the end of the day. Defensively, sometimes they were a 4-3, sometimes they were a 3-4. They adapted based on what they felt like they could do well. So I don't like it to get too hung up in, this guy's a Shanahan McVay style guy, or this guy's a New England style guy. He's been in both places. If he's got a brain in his head, he'll do it the Nick Caley way. All right. I want your goon. I don't know what that means, but it seems like it's a good and appropriate place to end here. So thanks. Hey, please like, subscribe. I'm Seth Payne, played for the Texans back in the day. That's Edward Frigarello. Figgy. He's off here. He's teaching me about Instagram. He's making a good case, but I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm built for Instagram. How do you pronounce your last name? Gilliard. All right, Gilliard. Edward Gilliard, but it's Figgy.